Hi, if you're watching this video, you're watching the final lesson in water systems. In this lesson, we'll be talking about the challenges and adaptations required for living in water. So, much of life that we know of lives in water. It is thought about 50 to 80% of all life on Earth either live in aquatic freshwater environments or marine environments. So, what do you need to live in water? Well, what do we call special skills or parts that plants and animals have that let them survive in their environment? We call them adaptations. These are abilities, behaviors, uh, uh, structures on their body that allow them to survive. For example, we have eyes to allow us to see. So you could say our eyes are adaptations to our environment, right? So that we can see our environment. One big adaptations aquatic or marine animals have is that they usually have gills. These allow animals to take in oxygen from the water. So in water, there's little bits of oxygen in the water dissolved in there. And so these gills take in that water and filter out the oxygen, allowing them to actually breathe oxygen in water. And so you can see this in this shark, you can see this in this axolotl, and this, I believe, insect here, right? Those are its gills. And so water will flow past them, oxygen will flow into those gills, and so those animals are able to survive, right? Getting around is another important skill or adaptation that animals need. So how do aquatic and marine animals move? Well, some have things called fins. These are adaptations or structures that allow the fish to move around, right? And they can have multiple fins. Tube feet, which is what starfish and sea urchins use. They sort of use water and they pump water into the feet pump out, and they move forward by constantly pumping out their feet. Or jet propulsion, which is what octopus use to fire jets of water out and push themselves forward. So how do aquatic animals eat? Well, these are also adaptations to allow them to survive in their environment, right? Whale sharks and other types of whales will filter food from the water. They'll just open their mouth and whatever is food will go into their stomach and the leftover water will just be pushed out through their gills, right? They can eat plants like these dugongs do, and they could just be herbivores. Or they could be carnivores like we see on land, like great white sharks and the seal. From breathing to eating, aquatic life have adaptations to meet their needs for survival. Some are pretty easy to understand. You can see that these teeth are basically shaped to capture prey. But some are a little bit harder. So pause the video and think about, what would a walrus need those teeth for? Now, before you say catching prey, they are herbivorous. They eat plants. So why would you need these sharp teeth, these tusks? Well, believe it or not, they actually use these tusks as ice picks, right? So when the walrus is in the water, they're very heavy. It's hard for them to pull themselves up because they don't have hands. So they actually dig into the ice with those teeth and pull themselves up. Aquatic plants. Well, there are two main types of aquatic plants. There are attached plants, plants that basically anchor to the bottom. They sit at the bottom and they grow up. Or free-floating plants. These are plants that just sort of don't have any root system or any attachment. They just sort of float around in the water and do what they do best. So there's attached plants and free-floating plants. Attached plants, these plants root themselves to the seafloor. Sometimes parts of the plant, or most of the plant, can be above water. Seaweed is an example, and water lilies are another example. Right? The plant extends all the way to the seafloor and is rooted there. And some of the plant may be above the surface, but the base of the plant is found at the bottom of the ocean, lake, or river. Free-floating plants are plants that just sort of float around. Typically, they're usually one-celled or single-celled. Plankton is an example of a free-floating plant. These cells sort of float along the water, and they sort of do what plants do, photosynthesis, while being pushed around by waves. And so they exist sort of floating around. Sometimes they stick together, but for the most part, they just kind of float around. In this video, we'll talk about that in more detail. Aquatic food chains. Well, what is a food chain? A food chain is a model that shows what plants and animals are eaten or being eaten. Right? Most chains start, at least with aquatic systems, start with phytoplankton. Now, plankton that we talked about here can come in two forms. And so if you see the word phyto, which sounds like photosynthesis, phytoplankton are plant plankton. There are zooplankton, you can see there, which eat phytoplankton, which then get eaten by small fish, bigger fish, and bigger fish. And so this would create an aquatic or marine food chain, where one thing is being eaten by another. How do humans affect aquatic life? Well, we've talked about pollution before, but also fishing, right? These two are the biggest factors that affect the environment in oceans, lakes, and rivers. Humans releasing chemicals in the environment can make the environment toxic. As animals eat these toxins, they enter the food chain, right? So as phytoplankton take in toxins, the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, but then they take in those toxins, and so on and so forth. And so over time, more and more toxin, more and more poisonous material is building up in the food chain. This is called biomagnification. As toxins enter the animals, they build up in their predators, right? So the mayflies take a little bit of poison. This fish eats the mayfly larva, which builds up more poison. The bass then eats that, which builds up more poison. And then when it gets to us, we consume all of that poison over time, right? And this is very true with a chemical called mercury. Biomagnification with mercury is very dangerous. Mercury poisoning can affect our balance, our senses, can affect our cells, and can make us very, very sick. And so this is very important to understand, to know how fish and the pollution in their environment can actually negatively affect our lives. Plastic pollution. As we throw plastics away, it affects the sea life, right? Animals can get stuck in this plastic. Animals can confuse the plastic for food and eat that, right? And they can also die from that. Overfishing, pretty straightforward. As we fish, we provide food for people, but we take fish from the environment. And if we overfish, well, then there's less food in that environment, and that food chain suffers. And this damages the life that would eat or survive on that food or on that animal. So aquatic life is very complicated. You have different adaptations that allow you to survive, eat, swim, move around. In addition, you need adaptations to survive as different types of plants, as well as there are food chains in the water that allow animals and plants to eat each other. And on top of that, our interactions with those environments can negatively affect them through plastics and other types of pollution. So hopefully you found this video useful, and I'll see you next lesson.